Well, good evening. Welcome to the show. Very, very big news there from Canberra with the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. A lot to talk about. We'll go through it in some significant detail, but I think it's best we get straight back to Canberra, bringing in Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh. She is across it, as am I. Load of notes here on my desk. Trudy, let's try and take people through the detail if we can. Give us your read.
Peter, it's been a marathon meeting of National Cabinet this afternoon. There was certainly no guarantee that we would emerge from this with the thresholds, but this is exactly what we have tonight. Now, a national agreement about exactly how many Australians need to get a COVID vaccination before we can reopen in some real form. Let's take a look at the numbers. This is the vaccine targets nationally and that will be required state by state. The first one to move from phase A, what we're in now, to phase B, that is a 70% target. To then move on to phase C, nationally, we have to reach 80%. Crucially, though, the Prime Minister pointing to two keys. Yes, nationally, we must get to 70%. But for example, in New South Wales, they also have to reach 70% of their state population to move through the phases. Let's remind people, though, what are the phases? This is phase B, the transition phase, the next one we will move to. Less restrictions for fully vaccinated Australians. That's because the PM says they pose less of a public health risk. Lockdowns less likely. The restoration of inbound passenger caps, so they were slashed as the risk of Delta, they will be boosted again, and you will be able to see students and visa holders enter Australia. Phase C, this is known as the consolidation phase. This was the 80% target. This is further down the track, most likely much later into next year. No broad lockdowns, domestic travel freedoms if you're vaccinated. You'll be able to go overseas too if you're vaccinated. And also you can consider travel bubbles, things like Singapore and the Pacific. It's certainly a lot of detail, Peter, and we will see kind of a two-speed country now here. States will come in and out of these restrictions at their own pace as we see the differences across the country when it comes to the vaccine rollout. Worth noting right now, as it stands, 18% of Australians eligible fully vaccinated.
Yeah, I just thought it'd be worth picking up a couple of points. I mean, very clearly the Prime Minister said we are in the suppression phase. I think no one believes that. We're very much in an eradication phase. But he confirmed that lockdowns now are an authorised tool. They're a recommended tool, statewide lockdowns, metropolitan-wide lockdowns. It couldn't have been clearer there that we have lockdowns now for the foreseeable future. If we are at 18% vaccinated, Trudy, we've got to get to 70 to start to move away from lockdowns and eventually get into the point where it might be LGAs or particular towns and suburbs, not right across capital cities. But that's an extraordinary uptake of vaccinations required. I had a bit of a scan around the rest of the world. I mean, Germany's only at 51%. The UK's close to 60%. France is 45%. Spain, 56%. Canada is the highest. No, it's not. Canada's 57%. Chile is 63%. The UAE is 70%. I mean, these are an extraordinary litmus for where the world is. They are opening at much lower numbers than this new target announced by the Prime Minister tonight.
Well, his hope will be, Peter, that Australia has always done incredibly well with vaccination take-up, that Australia is a vaccination nation, that people are willing to go out and get the jab. In terms of the level of hesitancy that's out there, further down the track, we know that the Treasurer has said he's willing to look at very strong incentives. Can businesses do more? Can there be lotteries and things like that? So once you get to that level, that there can be incentives for people who are considering whether not to get the jab, that they will then be incentivised to go out and do it. At the moment, let's be clear though, one of the main issues is supply. We're still waiting on that so-called flood of Pfizer doses to actually arrive in the country. Not everyone who wants to get the jab at the moment can easily go out and get one.
Look, I think that's right. And I think to be fair, a lot of the hesitancy there has been to this date. Now, it may well turn around, but it has been related to AstraZeneca. More Pfizer out there, I suspect we'll see a real lift. You're right to make the point about Australia's generalised vaccination levels. It's well into the 90s. We lead the world in childhood vaccinations. This is a little bit different. This is a lot of adults taking vaccinations. It's not necessarily because they're wanting to travel to countries that require it on arrival. Interestingly, I've had a lot of messages from small business. They think this is a big target. they think this means for them lockdowns for the foreseeable future. You made the point about that 80% number, which is phase 3, the end of lockdowns, being something we might not get to next year. The PM made the point about the economic advice being lockstep with the health advice. I didn't hear him say that they will be released in full. We think, won't we, that we'll get some of this detail, he said, in a couple of days, Trudy.
Yeah, there's no commitment at this stage to have all of this information put on the table. Even ahead of this meeting, Scott Morrison indicated we might not see anything at all today. So it is a step forward that publicly now people have an idea of where the states are headed on this. But in terms of that sort of modelling from Treasury as well, we don't know what they're being told behind the scenes about exactly how much this is going to cost the economy, what the impact is there going to be on growth. Interesting to hear the Prime Minister pretty buoyant about the December quarter, but we don't know how long Sydney's lockdown is going to last, and that's going to be so critical for determining that December number.
Well, we know that the numbers out this week that the Sydney lockdown is $1 billion a week. Melbourne wasn't so much in terms of the payments coming out of the Commonwealth, but if we've got lockdowns on the table until we get to 70%, it's going to be a lot of money coming out of the coffers in Canberra in particular. What I thought was interesting, Trudy, too, we haven't seen much from the government, state or federal, in terms of what's the benefits of vaccination other than personal health risk. He made it very clear there's this new task force, didn't he? The PM said, set up with the premiers of the Chief Minister of the NT, Premier of Victoria, Premier of Tasmania, and their job is to go away and report back to National Cabinet with basically the list of benefits that if you are in a lockdown or in a series of restrictions, that the vaccinated residents of that state will get, freedom of movement, let's say, that is different than those that are unvaccinated. It's a bit of a carrot. I thought that was interesting. And also he made some pretty pointed comments about digital vaccine certificates, the ability to load them into your phones. Now, once they can be carried with you on your person, I suspect, like we're seeing in France and the UK, you want to go to a footy match or you want to go to a major event, you're going to have to be able to show that vaccine passport. That's going to be a debate in Australia too.
Yeah, and we know that there's been pushback in the past to having a national ID card. You know, there will be some people who would be hesitant to have to show this sort of proof, but I think that's where this is headed, that we're going to have these digital proof that you've had 2 jabs of the vaccine, and you're going to see 2 different classes of citizens. If you want to go to the AFL Grand Final, show that you've been vaccinated. That is where National Cabinet has landed here. There was resistance, we remember, not that many months ago from premiers about this idea of a vaccine passport altogether. So interesting to see now they appear to all be edging towards that is where we're going to have to land if we want to see these numbers increase to at least 70%. That's the benchmark tonight. Well, thank you, Trudy. I did like at the very end there was some carrot in the near or distant future that we'll be able to travel overseas again. He'll tell us where we can travel. That's the nature of COVID, but it is good to hear that that might be on the horizon. Well, it's been a long day for you, Trudy. Thank you for your time. Thanks, Peter. That's Trudy McIntosh in Canberra. Late press conference by the Prime Minister. A lot of detail will be released tonight. We'll be across it obviously here on Sky News. It will be in the newspapers tomorrow. But let's get some experts in. Professor of Epidemiology Tony Blakely joins me now. Tony, you've had as much time as everyone to digest this announcement from the Prime Minister. 4-stage roadmap. We've known that for about 10 days, but now we've sort of got flesh on the bones. We've got that interim target of 70 before we're going to see much change. 80 is when we're going to start to get some liberty back. What's your top line view?
It's pretty good. I think it's pretty good. It's light on detail. So those targets are not tied to a lot of things that we're going to get. So at 70%, we just move out of phase A to phase B, whatever that means. But it's going to probably mean things like that South Australian trial of bringing people back with modified quarantine. We'll see that kicking in. We'll see the limits on the international arrivals lifting up. And then at 80% vaccination coverage, we'll kick on into phase C. Again, exactly what that means has been left open, which I think is the right thing to do. It is so hard to predict this pandemic. But at that point, we move into phase C, we'll be starting to see Australian citizens being able to travel with as long as they've got vaccination, travelling in and out with more freedoms. So it's more of a qualitative steer with 2 numbers, 70%, 80%. The other thing I like about it, and I've been saying this quite a lot in the last couple of weeks, is that vaccination is not a silver bullet. You need to have all these measures around it. And so I see this 70, then 80% with measures around it as being quite sensible, and there'll be a lot more flesh to put on these bones in the next couple of months.
Look around the world, though. The only country I can see that's got to 70% is the UAE. And of course, most of Europe in a staged way, some more than others, are open for business. What's this going to do to our economy?
Oh, look, no panic, no panic. 70% is what we're going to achieve. We've got to get there first. So I just saw today in the New York Times that the European Union has now overtaken the US on its vaccination coverage, and we are talking about percentage of the adult population here. Kids will come in next year. And, some countries have achieved it. Niue, little island in the Pacific, has got 97% vaccination coverage for first dose, I understand. So you can achieve these things. And we've seen in the last 12 months the fact that we've brought vaccines in where they didn't exist before, because of course we can achieve these targets by Christmas. I'm pretty relaxed about getting to 70%. 80% will take a bit more push, but as people see the benefits they get from it, and then once we do open up the borders, people see that you still are at risk of getting sick and being hospitalised, it will just keep going up, I hope.
Yeah, but my point was, you were talking about first jabs versus second jabs. The Prime Minister's setting this at fully vaccinated, and I've looked at the numbers around the world of fully vaccinated. The only country there on my list of about 40 that I could find was the UAE, which is now in excess of 70. But a lot of countries like France is open, and their fully vaccination levels are 45.6, Italy 50.5. It's open, Spain is open. My point is, we've got to get to 80 to open basically our international borders. We've got to get to 70 to join up again like a country, not just 70 nationally, of course. In the detail tonight, it's 70 in the state you live in to open the state you live in up and move away from lockdowns. That's another sort of 6 tough months for Australians.
I hear where you're coming from, but I don't think your comparisons are the correct ones to make, because those are with countries that have played the whole... Well, because those are the countries that have played it completely differently, whereby they've had a lot of natural infections as well as immunisation to get up, and it's been messy. We've gone the elimination route, like it or not, and actually it's been a pretty damn good route. What that means is that we need to rely more on the vaccination to get us up to some form of immunity, not vaccination and natural infection, and then open up on our own terms. So I see that as fine. It might mean that we're not as open up as France for a few months or so. That's okay. When we get to that point, we can open up with lesser restrictions. There will still be some infection that comes into the country at 80% vaccination, but it will be manageable. It won't, I wouldn't have wanted to live in France last year when they were dealing with the situation they had then.
No, but I think we come from a very privileged position, Tony Blakely. Both of us have got money in our pockets and our jobs are relatively secure. I think the small business tonight will react with a fair amount of disappointment, I guess, at the time frames looking ahead.
Well, I'm not sure that I agree with you, because if you look at New Zealand, you look at the Australian economy, it's done extremely well when we have had zero transmission using an elimination strategy. So for New South Wales, I agree with you there. In the next couple of months, that's a really bad situation for small businesses. But for the rest of Australia, hanging out and largely zero transmission and getting the vaccination coverage up before you open is probably the best economically. But I do agree with you that New South Wales at the moment is in a really tricky situation economically. I agree with you there.
Or if you rely on people coming through the door to make your way financially. Tony Blakely, I really appreciate your time jumping in as quickly as you have tonight. Much appreciated by my viewers and myself. Thank you.
Pleasure. Hope it was useful.
Right, quite a lot of other things I want to get to. National Cabinet is more in that, of course, and a whole lot of headlines all around the country. To do that, I'm joined now from Sydney by 2GB's radio host and voice of the people here on Credlin, Luke Grant. Lots of detail there, Luke. I won't go through it all again, but I made the point with an epidemiologist, I suppose, not necessarily an economist or a small business operator. But I mean, I get the Prime Minister's got to land on a number and it comes out from the health experts, the Doherty Institute in Victoria. But if you're running a small business tonight that relies on a pub, let's say, relies on people to cross the threshold to make your money, this is sort of saying that there's lockdowns, not just might happen, but highly recommended until we get to 70 and only a bit of relief from 80. That's another 6+ months of this.
Well, it is. So there's no dates. I thought that was important, Peter, and also that there was no clarity from the Prime Minister that when we get to these levels, in fact, what they prescribe will actually be supported by the state premiers. I think he said, well, it'll be a brave premier to go against the numbers, but we have seen some interesting behaviour, haven't we, from the state leaders. And if you're in New South Wales, does that now mean that until we get to 70%, the lockdown remains? I mean, these are really big questions that I hope the PM and more particularly the Premier tomorrow in New South Wales might just answer. Look, I had my first AstraZeneca jab this week. I got to the point I was hesitant, like many people my age. I went and saw my GP. I feel pretty ordinary today, 2 or 3 days after it, but you look around you and you see plenty of other people who've had it, and you just get to that point where I did, where you think, that's probably the right thing to do. And I think Australians will encourage other Australians. They seem like big numbers. I'm with you. In the UK, they're not at 70% yet. I think they are on first jabs. So if we're going to try and get to 70, is that even this year? I don't know. It's good to have some
I doubt it will be.
Rewards. I'm with you. I doubt
to be
that
honest. To be honest, I don't think it'll be this year. If you look at the numbers around the world, there is nobody there other than the UAE that I can find that's at 70 now, right now. A lot of them in the high 50s and 60s. But my point is that their economies are open, will basically be shuttered at a state level, certainly at a Commonwealth level, shuttered at a state level until we get out of 70. But what I'd like to see too is a release by the Prime Minister of all the detail of the modelling, so there can be some transparent debate out there by other experts, both the economic modelling, of course, and the health modelling. But I'd also like to see a communique where all of the premiers sign it, formally sign on to this, because I think the great disappointment Australians have had is they've walked out of that room in Canberra or the virtual telecon, I don't know how many times, and then they do whatever they bloody well like. I think we need some certainty as Australians.
You're right.
Sign the bit of paper, all of them, and we've got a real plan.
And we never get the health advice, Peter, do we? We get some kind of mention maybe in a press release, but we never get to hear what they're told by the experts. You talk about walking out of a room. Let me put this to you. When you walk out of the surgery, when you walk out of the clinic, you've had the jab. What next? And you and I have talked about this for weeks, about freedom. Well, I don't want a lottery. I don't want a schooner of beer or a movie ticket. I want freedom. So you go and you put your arm and you get the jab. What do you get when you walk out of the room? I think tonight we've got an idea that there is a sense of freedom, but for all those who got vaccinated weeks or months ago, my God, it's a hell of a wait, isn't it?
Yeah, look, what was really positive, the Prime Minister made the point at the 70% threshold. I mean, 80 comes with a lot of freedom, but even at 70, there was a committee formed of state premiers to go away and say, for vaccinated people in this particular state, there will be different levels of restrictions because you are vaccinated as opposed to being vaccinated. So I always think with this stuff, it's not so much the sticks, it's the carrots that get Australians to move. I thought that was very good. And obviously there'll be a whole lot of other things that come your way if you're vaccinated. That might be the real motivator. You want to go to the footy or the Melbourne Cup, you've got to be jabbed. Yeah,
and I mean, we've got QR codes so people know where there'll be all these conspiracies, won't there? Oh, my God, we've got to have a vaccine passport. Well, we've essentially already got one now. I was reading something about ethics, medical ethics, and the professor I was reading said it's a bit like the seatbelt. We mandated that for public health. We're not exactly mandating vaccines, but if it's mandatory that if you go to a public event that might be an area where it could be spread, then I have trouble arguing against at least the common sense of that. You should be able to go to the footy and know that everyone you're with is kind of, okay, and you'll be okay.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm not worried about myself. I'm worried about my 70-year-old mum or anyone who's elderly and vulnerable. Yeah. All right. Well,
your mum
you have a good
and
weekend,
mum,
Luke.
You too. See you, Peter.
There you go. All right. Hope you feel better. All right. We'll keep you up to date on all of this. I know it's a movable feast, but I've got my computer on here and we'll see what happens as the detail hits the press go in Canberra. Let's move on. After the break, high-profile Melbourne barrister, former Greens candidate Julian Burnside. He's in the headlines again. I'll tell you why. Welcome back. You're watching Credlin. Well, he's no stranger to controversy. The now high-profile Melbourne barrister, former Greens candidate for the Melbourne seat of Kooyong, Julian Burnside, back in the headlines. In recent days, Burnside has come under fire following a controversial Twitter post likening Israelis to Nazis, saying that the treatment of the Palestinians looks horribly like the German treatment of the Jews during the Holocaust. His post was in reference to a Human Rights Watch report into violations of international law during 11 days of fighting back in May between Israeli forces and Hamas militants. Now, Jewish figures have accused Julian Burnside of anti-Semitism, and there are growing calls for him to step down as a member of the Victorian Bar. One person leading the charge is Liberal Senator for Victoria and Chair of the Senate's Legal and Constitutional Affairs Legislation Committee, Sarah Henderson. She joins me now. Sarah, you've taken this on. You've written a very strong letter to the Victorian Bar Council saying you've got grave concerns about the conduct of Julian Burnside, a senior member. You remind them of the Victorian Bar. Tell us your concerns.
Well, Peter, good evening. And as I said, in response to that terrible tweet by Julian Burnside, it's probably the most vile, shocking and contemptible statement ever made by a senior member of the Victorian Bar. And that's why I have lodged a formal complaint with the Victorian Bar Council, because there is a range of barristers' rules which apply, including in relation to ensuring that barristers do not bring the legal profession into disrepute. And I have certainly raised the complaint that I believe by Julian Burnside's conduct that he has done so.
Now, does that relate to conduct in the court, or does that Bar Council rules, or does that relate to, a social media activity like this? Do they cover? Well,
the barristers' rules don't actually say. It's under the headline in the rules advocacy, but it doesn't actually say. So it can be read as being applied generally. And there are also rules in relation to barristers undertaking other vocations and making sure that a barrister's role is first and foremost. And so I've also raised concerns about that. But I am disappointed the Bar Council has written back and said there's no jurisdiction for its ethics committee to hear the complaint, but it has proposed that this will be heard by the Legal Services Commissioner. And I do really hope that we will see Julian Burnside being held to account. Because, Peter, let's not forget that as a Queen's Counsel, he occupies a position of great eminence. Only the most respected and eminent barristers become Queen's Counsels. It's a very, very special appointment, and that's why I have raised whether he is a fit and proper person to continue to retain the appointment of Queen's Counsel.
He has taken to Twitter again this afternoon saying that he apologises to Australian Jews and to Holocaust survivors. Of course, very many of them, as you know, in Victoria, and their families. For my comparison, he says, of Israeli-Palestinian actions with the Holocaust, since the Balfour Declaration, the Palestinian-Israeli contest has been about land. The Holocaust was about genocide. But you reckon he's now walking back that comment, and even that comment, is it enough?
Well, it's not enough, and it was not enough. The Australian Greens did not condemn their candidate who ran in the seat of Kooyong in 2019. Adam Bandt made some very wishy-washy comments and did not condemn Julian Burnside for this absolutely appalling statement. And we are seeing from the left in the ALP, we are seeing also some really worrying anti-Semitic statements and sentiments. We saw some conduct from Young Labor a number of months ago, and that tweet had to be retracted. Jed Carney was involved in that particular sentiment. So we are seeing really concerning strains of anti-Semitism on the left of politics, and not, well, I will make it very clear, not from people like Kimberly Kitching, who has been very strong and actually came out on Twitter and said that what Julian Burnside said was absolutely evil. But look, he has walked this apology back, and I'm looking at a tweet from a woman called Jill Marie Dixon, and she says, "I'm sorry it came to this," referring to the apology. "A pile-on claiming anti-Semitism was inevitable because it always follows as night the day." And Julian Burnside retweeted that particular post. So he is walking that apology back, and frankly, that's just as shocking. And, I think it was last year, he met with the Anti-Defamation Commission. He apologised for some previous conduct when he compared Peter Dutton to the Nazis. He apologised for that conduct, but it seems that this man has learned absolutely nothing.
Yeah, but just on that point, why is there a level of tolerance? This is not the first time he's strayed into this area. Why is there a level of tolerance on the left, you know, not for sexist comments, not for racial comments, but anti-Semitism's okay?
Peter, I just simply don't know. All I know is that some of the sentiments that we are hearing from the left of politics and from the likes of Julian Burnside are absolutely shocking. And I'm just looking, because this is all rolling off the press at the, you know, just a short time ago, Josh Frydenberg sent Julian Burnside a copy of Holocaust survivor Eddie Jaku's remarkable book. And he says that he hopes he finds it educational after his indefensible and insensitive tweet. And we all have a collective duty to ensure the atrocities of the Holocaust are not only understood, but never repeated. And so Josh has spoken brilliantly about the importance of ensuring that we never forget what happened in the Holocaust. We always remember, and we always make sure that this must never, ever happen again. So what we are hearing from the left is frankly shocking and frightening. And I think that barristers in Melbourne and people of the legal profession in Melbourne have got to come down on Julian Burnside like a ton of bricks.
Sarah Henderson, thank you for your time.
It's great to talk to you, Peter.
Let's move to another issue. One of Australia's most notorious motorcycle gangs is pushing for more turf. Hells Angels are looking to expand into Melbourne, opening up a city chapter to take on the rivals, the Mongols. Now, this is a huge concern for Melbourne residents, as if they haven't had enough injecting rooms, all sorts of things, and obviously all those lockdowns, with fears that violence could spill onto the streets. And it's a result of a lack of tough legislation about motorcycle gangs in Victoria. My next guest has a unique expertise in outlaw motorcycle gangs. He's a researcher in organised crime and corruption and has spent 2 decades in state government policy and projects before joining the Queensland University of Technology. Associate Professor Mark Laux, thank you, joining us now from Brisbane. Professor, please correct me if I didn't get your surname right there for you, but help my viewers understand, why is Victoria being targeted and why has the government left Victoria wide open to these sorts of gangs?
Basically, what's happened in Victoria traditionally is the Victorian police had a much greater concentration on the other types of organised crime that we all saw in the Underbelly TV shows. So even when we were going to organised crime conferences around Australia, the Victorian police would say, look, the bikies at the moment just aren't our focus. So in that sense, they're slightly behind what was happening in Queensland and New South Wales and South Australia, and now Western Australia, even the Northern Territory and Tasmania, where they've been catching up with the legislation that South Australia began. The first successful legislation were the Vlad laws in Queensland, which have been changed by the current government. But this legislation means that the outlaw motorcycle gangs can't operate in the manner they normally would. So they are displaced to other places. And the people who move aren't the 80% who have like a traffic infraction or something like that. It's the 10 to 20% that we all see in the newspaper that go to court for major violent offences, drug offences, organised crime offences and things like that. And a lot of the Queensland ones moved to Victoria when the Vlad laws came in, and we saw Shane Bowden actually came back from Victoria to Queensland after he got out of prison and was murdered in Queensland. So Victoria is, in that sense, slightly behind the other states and is therefore getting this displaced population of motorcycle club members moving to there and to the ACT as well.
Yeah, so just on that point, so we can all follow it very clearly, when the tough legislation comes in, when the tough rules come in a place like Queensland and then in New South Wales, these bikies don't give up their drug trade and their illicit activity. No. They don't turn good, if I can say that. They just go and find a new jurisdiction that has got lighter controls in order to keep the trade going, and now they've found themselves in Victoria. You make the point that Victorian police have said they were busy on other things, and we know they had Lawyer X down here. They had a whole lot of issues there at some time in relation to terror and other things. But surely they can take the template legislation out of Queensland or New South Wales and put it through the Victorian Parliament, and that would then, I presume, cause these gangs to move out of Victoria.
Well, they're running out of places to go as well. I mean, the ACT will never bring in the legislation because the government's had the opportunity. They don't intend to do it for, obvious human rights issues that are involved with it. But it's just that natural progression that we see in criminology where it becomes hard for you to operate in a particular location, but you can operate somewhere else, you will go there. That's what displacement does. So at the moment, that displacement has to be Victoria and the ACT. And while Victoria is still without the legislation, people will continue to go there. And finally, if Victoria brings in the legislation, the motorcycle gangs would move to the ACT to operate. So if Victoria does not bring in this legislation, they will continue to see that displacement coming into the state.
I've got to go, but the toughest measure in this legislation is not allowing them to associate together. Is that right? Yeah, because association means they can't operate in the normal way that a motorcycle club does in the community that you can see in Victoria and we used to see in Queensland, where they're riding around together, where they're displaying their colours and other things and socialising together. So they can't socialise together openly as a club in Queensland or New South Wales. So they can do that in Victoria, correct? All right, well, that's what the government needs to do. We'll keep the pressure up. Associate Professor Mark Locks, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
All right, still to come. Firecracker panel, lots to discuss beyond just what we saw at the top of the show. Plenty of other issues around. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. Good to see it is a busy Friday night. All right, lots to get across now with my panel. Let's start with this. A question mark's been raised over models used by leading scientists to estimate global warming levels. Gavin Schmidt of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies has stated many of the world's leading models are now projecting warming rates that most scientists, including the model makers themselves, believe are implausibly fast. That's a huge concession in the whole issue of climate change. And it indicates more attention needs to be paid to the Earth's natural cycles. To discuss this and more, I'm joined from Sydney by the host of Outsiders, editor of Spectator, and so much more, Rowan Dean, social commentator, Prue Sween. Rowan, this is you have been crusading on this issue for I don't know how long, about digging into the detail, reading the empirical evidence, holding them to account on their own numbers and data. It hasn't just been rhetoric, you've been in the weeds. Big admission.
Well, when I read that, I just went, hallelujah, finally. Either they've been watching Outsiders and Ice Age Watch and they kind of thought, hang on, let's actually find out what is really going on, or they've actually just come clean. It's been clear for a long time, Peter, that the models, much like, funnily enough, the COVID models from the same mob at Imperial College in Britain, were way, way off the mark, that they were every climate model going back to the 70s and 80s that predicted, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010, 2020s, they've all been way, way exaggerated. And the reality every time is always far, far less. And often, there was one example I showed only recently, Peter, where someone averaged out all the climate models over the past 40 years and matched them against reality. And guess what? Reality was lower than even the lowest of all the climate models. So reality refuses to do what the climate model says, which tells us one thing and one thing only, Peter. When the empirical evidence doesn't match the theory, then the theory must be wrong.
Something's going on inside the climate religion, Prue, because we had that Michael Moore documentary, which really just opened up the debate on renewables. The king of the left going out there saying that, the emperor of renewables has no clothes. And now you've got these NASA scientists saying that our models are flawed. Our models are basically overcooked.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? I don't understand what the realities are of that those concessions, other than maybe they're waking up to themselves. And we're all everybody cares about the environment. We all want the environment to survive. We want to be as kind to it as possible. But the lines are blurred, aren't they, by these activists, these cults, these subsidised scientists who are just, have, swallowed the Kool-Aid. So there is something going on, because it ain't adding up. And thank goodness, maybe people, the trouble is it's so entrenched now. You watch TV news now. climate change is blamed for everything. It's in schools. So I just don't know how we're going to change. I think the train has left the station.
Oh, I'm a bit more optimistic. I want to keep fighting and fighting and fighting. I mean, women could only go to university about 100 years ago, and about that time got the vote through. It took them many millennium, but we're here now. I reckon we can win the climate war. Rowan, I want to go to a pretty disturbing issue. This is happening on home soil. It's happening at the ANU. I mean, if you want to talk about a defence town, that defence town is Canberra. At the ANU, in what's called, I think they call it Initiation Week up there, but it's basically the O Week for students. There were a whole lot of students barred by the student union, particular groups, some activist group, an anti-abortion group. But of course, the ADF, the Australian Defence Force, was banned from having its little stall out there and interacting with students. Now, if you ban the ADF at the Australian National University, we have got something critically wrong. Alan Tudge is the minister. He says he's considering cutting funding to student unions if they don't back free speech. I tell you what, why is he even considering it? It should be done already.
Well, exactly. I'm going to say it again. Hallelujah, about time. I've got a lot of time for Alan Tudge. I think he's doing a great job. He could move a little bit faster on this one, but he's absolutely right in principle. We fund Australian taxpayers, hardworking business, small business people, families, workers, fund the most vile and vicious anti-capitalist, anti-democratic propaganda in our universities. And we need our defence forces. We need our defence forces with China sitting there to our north. We need them, and we need to be recruiting the best and the brightest from our universities. And for some rat bags to be sitting around probably after a few bongs on the bridge or wherever at the ANU, going, oh, we're not going to let the ADF in. No, defund them immediately. Let's start defunding. Let's take this much further than just universities. Why should we be paying out of our pockets for these people who want to destroy our way of life? And defund them, defund all these university groups, all these academics, all these courses that work against everyday average tax-paying democratic Aussies.
100%.
Spot on. You know, they sneer. They sneer at the tradies and those who haven't gone to universities, but they are the ones paying the taxes. They pay for them to have an education that, you spend a lot of money in other places around the world buying. I've got to go to this one. It's crazy, but it's out there. I've got to talk to you about it. Racism and how you teach children to eat. Apparently now, if you teach children good table manners, to using a knife and a fork, then you are dripping them with the shame of colonisation. That's what it's out there. A chef's out there saying that this is a chef in the United Kingdom, wrote an article about it, saying that basically table manners is racism. Prue.
I mean, this Sheila must be trying to flog a book or something to get some publicity. I mean, it is so absurd, isn't it? You know, when I was brought up, we had to have books under our arms so we didn't have those wings. And if we didn't have that, if the book fell, we got into trouble. And, manners are courtesy. It's a sign of breeding, and I just think it's so sad now. People just sit in front of the television. Kids don't know how to use a knife and fork if they're going to be judged later in life. And I just think it's so sad. There's a time and a place. When you're in India, you eat with your fingers, but you don't in the rest of the world. And apart from chopsticks, maybe in China. But, I just think it's appalling that we're losing all the traditions, all the values that really talk to us about who we are and just showing some respect and pride in ourselves. I think it's so appalling. I really drilled it into my kids, and I'm so glad I did, because when they're sitting down with the dean of the university or somebody, they have the confidence to know which knife and fork to use and what etiquette is all about. And it's so sad. Shame on the families that are not teaching their children that.
And look, I have to say, good manners breaks apart class boundaries. People will want to judge you on a perception of how you look or how you speak, but if they see you there with good manners, it obliterates class. That's what I think is so backward about this. Rowan, Dean, Prue McSween.
I'm going to get stuck into my Maccas.
Because you're in lockdown. You're in lockdown. All right. Thank you for your time as always. See you next week.
Guys.
See you next week. Thank you for your company. It's been a bit of a wild ride tonight, but I have enjoyed taking you through these new numbers. A lot of detail will come out in the next few days. I'll be back here, as you know, Monday night to pull it all apart, take it on again next week. Corey Bernardi's up next.